Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. As the world enters 2025, global tensions are on the rise, and with Donald Trump set to return to the White House, many are wondering what impact his presidency will have on global conflicts. Tonight, we are diving into the top conflicts to watch in the new year, what's at stake, what actions could be taken, and how Trump's policies might shape the outcome. Joining me now is Brenda Shaffer, professor at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in California. Dear Brenda, we're welcome to Inside Politics.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's start our conversation with a broader question. With Donald Trump's return to power, what contradictions do you think might arise in his foreign policy approach, especially concerning NATO and its role in Europe and Asia?
So Donald Trump's foreign policy approach, national security approach, is fundamentally different from the current approach of the Biden administration. And it all relates to the role of force in foreign policy. So many believe, let's say the Biden camp, that if you talk about force or if you're willing to use force, you're going to end up in wars. But it actually works the exact opposite. It's the willingness to, it's having the capacity and the willingness to use force that actually prevents wars. So actually, Trump, who was much, power through strength as a tenet of foreign policy in his first administration, actually what prevented many wars. The U.S. was involved in less wars. And I think this is going to be, a very big foundation of his foreign policy will be the willingness to use force, that being clearly articulated to all sorts of U.S. adversaries around the world. And also, not to waste time on silly wars. The U.S., unfortunately, in the past 20, 30 years has been involved in wars with no real clear military goals or outcomes. You can't measure defeat. The U.S. also makes it difficult for its partners, allies, and friends to finish wars. For instance, if you look at the American reaction to Azerbaijan fully asserting its sovereignty in its legal territories, leading to the exit of the Russian so-called peacekeepers there, this actually ended the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, right? But if you would have left people there, left the Russian forces there, this would have been continuation of the conflict. The same way that the Biden administration was with Israel in the Gaza Strip. If Biden hadn't kept a leash on Israel, this war probably would have been over in 2 months. And unfortunately, due to all the limitations, this is a war that still hasn't been concluded and has lasted already 15 months.
Well, the situation in Syria, in Gaza, in Ukraine, we should expect the special behavior of Donald Trump. And if I'm not mistaken, Trump reportedly urging an end to conflict in Gaza. And even before he will take his office on January 20, if I'm not mistaken, he was saying that he expects the war in Gaza to be ended. So what are your expectations from his presidency when it comes to the Middle East?
So first thing, in contrast to most leaders that if you analyze their speeches, their texts, you kind of get a entrance into their thinking. Trump uses words, in a sense, as part of a negotiation. It's the way to get his adversaries off balance. You really never know what he's going to do, and this is probably good in business negotiations, and I think it's also good in foreign policy. But I think that each conflict has very different dynamics, and the Trump administration will treat them differently. It's not this kind of philosophical thing, war is bad or war is good, but I think it really, with a realist approach that he has, it actually depends on the consideration. So in terms of Ukraine, Russia, yes, Trump will try to wind this war down. And has made that very clear. In terms of in Syria, I think that really Turkey's emergence as now the most important actor in Turkey, in Syria, and projecting into Iraq and affecting Iran. I think this realization in the U.S. may be something that many of us have seen for a couple of years already, but the realization of the rise of Turkey's power I think is starting to take root in Washington and clearly in Trump world. And I think they do see the very positive dynamic of having Turkish influence in Syria versus Iranian control of Syria. Basically, the Assad regime was a proxy for Iran and for Hezbollah, and it's a huge positive dynamic that now Hezbollah is out of Syria. It's much weaker in Lebanon. And Turkey is now the power in this region. Probably next, you're already seeing it in Iraq. Iraq is reading the room, is understanding. Even the Iranian-linked militias there are starting to see that Iran is weakened, and they need to maybe act more like Iraqi actors in the domestic political arena, and not just proxies of Iran. And certainly, unquestionably, you're going to see from the Trump administration zero tolerance for the Houthis. This adds about 1% to global inflation. It adds transportation costs to LNG and oil. So everyone in the world is paying for this Houthi ridiculous game that disrupts international shipping. So I'm sure on day one, you will see shock and awe from Trump administration. And in fact, even the Biden administration on its last legs in recent weeks is starting to be more attentive to the Houthi threat. Up until now, Biden was always hoping to get some kind of deal with Iran, so he was very tolerant of the Houthis as an Iranian proxy. But in the last couple of weeks, when it's clear there's no more deal to be made, you're seeing even the Biden administration is being much more assertive vis-a-vis the Houthis. So they're probably having their last hurrah as well.
So, Brenda, should we expect that Donald Trump will pay more attention to the behavior of Iran in the region and its future expectations in the Middle East in comparison to what we saw from Joseph Biden?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's very hard for countries like Azerbaijan that border Iran, and every 4 years when there's a shift in elections in Washington, there's a dramatic shift in U.S. policy. But this time I think it's the Biden administration and Obama before him, and essentially their foreign policy of Obama and Biden were quite similar. They were only concerned about Iranian nuclear and actually wanted to see Iran have a bigger role in the region. Kind of a far-fetched idea, but they thought that if Iran had a seat at the table, Iran would behave differently. That's not how it works actually in reality. But Trump, in contrast, always saw a connection between Iran's regional behavior as well. And then, if you remember, under Trump, he assassinated Soleimani, the main sponsor, preparer, of the terror proxies throughout the Middle East. Can you imagine how different the Middle East could be? I mean, Syria, a stable place where the refugees can return to, Lebanon without being run by Hezbollah, Iraq being able to use all its oil wealth, and use that for its people. Gaza doesn't seem that the Iranian proxy role, yes, they were able to give a big hit to civilians in Israel, but has this really benefited the Palestinian people or even Hamas? So all the Iranian proxies are, if the Middle East didn't have the activity of these Iranian proxies, it could really be a paradise. And I think the Trump administration realizes this.
So it seems that Israel has specific expectations from Trump's presidency for the future development in a region when it comes to Syria, situation in Gaza. But do you think the countries bordering Israel are willing to have stability in the region, willing to see the peaceful development in the region, and how exactly the bordering states may contribute to that?
Right. So I think there's great potential with Syria, maybe not a formal peace, but one with basically Turkish extreme more than influence over the new government and Turkey's a state. Turkey's a rational actor. I think that creates a lot of opportunity for Israel and Turkey. I think their interests overlap in a stable Syria, which doesn't serve as a launching pad to PKK threats against Turkey, and doesn't serve as a launching pad to Iranian and other militias' attacks on Israel. I mean, they both have an interest in protecting their own security and also a viable Syria. Especially for Turkey, they need a viable Syria, so the majority of the Syrian refugees that live in Turkey can go back. I think why I'm somewhat optimistic, or as Reagan said, trust but verify, just give this a chance. One is during the Syrian civil war, the heights of the civil war, it was well known, there were mobile hospitals and aid centers set up at the border between Israel and Syria. And many of the fighters, including ones connected to the current new government in Syria, actually came to Israel for medical care, treatment, getting food, water. Even some funny stories when people, al-Nusra fighters that were hurt, injured, and then they wake up in the hospital, they realize they're in Israel, and they're afraid. It's like, no, sir, we just saved your leg, So one, there was already this tradition of humanitarian assistance. It was called good neighbor policy. And then also in 2021, 2022, there were some pretty serious negotiations that would have led to Israeli gas export to Syria and Iran. So there was contracts for Egypt to increase its gas exports or to start gas exports to Syria and Lebanon because they have very poor electricity provision. And at the same time, Egypt was increasing its imports from Israel. So essentially, gas molecules don't sing Hava Nagila when they move through pipelines. It would have meant Israeli gas essentially going into Syria and Lebanon. And everyone knew about this, all the sides, and everyone wanted to be pragmatic. By the way, speaking of energy, the energy crisis currently in Iran is almost unprecedented. It's not just a lack of electricity or natural gas or refined products, but truly systemic energy meltdown, all three. And really with nowhere in sight. It's not like, let's say in the European gas crisis, you could say, okay, it was just gas, and once the winter comes or they can bring in more LNG, sure, it'll be a cost, but they were able to keep the lights on and to keep homes heated. Literally areas where people do not have heat, highways without lights, and at the same time, Iran is threatening all its neighbors while it can't even keep the lights on at home.
Brenda, a bit more about situation in Ukraine. In your opinion, how will the potential ceasefire deal in Ukraine impact the security dynamics in Europe, and what role could the US play in ensuring its sustainability?
Right. So first thing, I think again, the U.S. will recognize the importance of Turkey in both Ukraine and Syria, and that's why I predict there's high probability of a closer relationship between Turkey and the United States under the Trump administration. And Europe, yes, the Trump administration, something that's been very clear in the past and currently is that the Europeans have to pay their share and do their share when on issues especially that affect European security, like Ukraine. Directly affects Europe, it indirectly affects the United States, and I think that with all the current attempts to lower expenditures, that there will be an expectation from Europe to pay its dues and to take the lead on the post-conflict security in Ukraine.
Again, there is a different approach to the situation in Ukraine, how Joseph Biden insisted and how tried to attract global attention to the situation between Russia and Ukraine, and how Trump is trying to say that he is able to end the war within a day, if possible. And I would like to bring your attention to the recent interview of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where he expressed confidence in President-elect Trump's ability to broker peace talks with Russia. Do you think that there is a potential role Donald Trump can play in facilitating a settlement between Russia and Ukraine, especially in context of its relations with European powers, or it will be more referring to the European powers, European countries to support, especially from military side, the Ukraine in the future?
Well, no, those terms together, European and powers, I don't think they're much of a match because, most of the European countries don't have really sufficient, really active militaries and or willingness to use their militaries. And when you look at, for instance, one of the only members of NATO that actually can deploy in real military situations, not doing humanitarian work or social work, it's the United States and Turkey, right? And in Europe, maybe Poland has a real military, in NATO, the UK, but for most of these countries, they can't really they can't really contribute forces or even serious armaments. And again, they need to start changing their activities and spending more money on their military budgets, regardless of Trump. Even just, I think if there's a lesson also that Turkey and Israel have learned in recent years from the United States, that countries need to be not dependent on U.S. military supplies, components, because every time there's a new election, the U.S. changes its security policy, and you could find yourself missing some unique component. So I think Europeans need to think about their own security and not always being dependent on the United States.
Do you think it's possible, taking into account all of those political and economic crises we saw last year in Germany, in France, for example, that's the first and the second largest European economy?
Well, these crises that you mentioned in Germany and France are they brought on to themselves by assuming the existence of an energy transition that doesn't exist. By there's no signs that we don't need fossil fuels, that we don't need, especially natural gas, especially in Europe. There's no indications that actually renewable energy, especially wind and solar, can replace natural gas and other fossil fuels. And by being so tenacious and dogmatic about this, they've really hurting their own economies. France, at least, has retained its nuclear power, and Germany closes its own nuclear reactors but imports power from France. So what's the point? Why to destroy your own nuclear power? So basically, this issue of deindustrialization in Europe, it's self-created. It's not because of international conditions or lack of skilled labor or lack of resources. It's a choice not to use the resources. And we're going into a world now where the U.S., at least up until now, and Europe and Canada are taking and its allies in Asia are taking steps to create more expensive and unreliable electricity, while the U.S. and European adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, are having cheaper and more reliable electricity because they're continuing with fossil fuels and not mixing their fuel, their electricity sources. So in terms of long-term economic edge, if you have cheap and reliable power, obviously that's an economic advantage. And if you have expensive power, your goods are going to be knocked out of the market. So essentially, this is something Europe has decided to do to itself. The U.S. up until under the Biden administration was taking similar steps. Obviously, under Trump, it's going to be a completely different deal, and he will do everything to unleash American energy potential. And this is something also for countries like Azerbaijan, Middle East countries. It's going to be a completely different era, much more realistic about the prospects of an energy transition.
Talking about European independence when it comes to economy and energy policy, we shouldn't ignore the growing importance of China and how Trump's administration will react on that. How do you think President Trump's potential shift in policy toward Taiwan and China's presence, its growing influence in the region?
Right. So I think if you look at U.S. foreign policy over most of the post-World War II periods, in periods when the US was cooperative with China and the Soviet Union, then Russia, these were very fruitful periods for the United States. When the period when the United States was in conflict with one of them, these were also relatively stable periods for the United States. Currently, the United States is in conflict with Russia and China, and the US, through its sanctions, brought China and Russia together. So the worst possible arrangement. I think the Trump administration will try to pry these two apart. They will also try to pry Russia and Iran apart, and that probably is a very good strategy. Like for the US to be in conflict with all of them together and drive them together in a way that even the competitive aspects between Russia and China, Russia and Iran are, disappear, I think is a very, very big strategic blunder, and that needs to change.
So Brenda, just to conclude our today's conversation, you think that United States will try to strengthen its cooperation with Turkey in order to, let's say, affect the processes, political processes taking place in the Middle East, in Syria, in Gaza, for example, and even in Europe, as we discussed, and between Russia and Ukraine as well, right?
Right. So I think Turkey's role in a settlement of the Ukraine-Russia war is essential. I think Turkey's role in a settlement between Ukraine and Russia is essential. Turkey's influence in Syria, Iraq, and even on Iran is essential. It's the most important external actor, and I believe the Trump administration and key people in Trump administration will recognize that. Of course, there's always the U.S. Congress, and it has its interests, and it's often influenced by the Greek, Armenian, Gulen, PKK lobbies in the United States, and also Turkey's a proud country. Sometimes there are some statements that create some crises with Washington. But I believe the Trump administration will recognize the essential role of Turkey in the most pressing conflicts, and will want and prefer to work with the state versus all sorts of militias and small actors.
Well, Brenda, thank you. Thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today.
My pleasure.
More on the role of Turkey as an emerging regional and global power, we will talk with our expert joining now from Turkey is Melih Demirtas, researcher at Cappadocia University. Warm welcome to Inside Politics.
Thank you, Ms. Lavrina.
Thank you so much. So with our expert before, we discussed the growing role of Turkey, the cooperation with Donald Trump's new administration that will take place in the White House in a few weeks. Therefore, my first question, I guess you will agree with me that Turkey is emerged as one of the major powers in the region, especially after the events in Syria in the latest time last year. So what are your expectations from the future role of Turkey in the Middle East and its cooperation with the new administration in the White House?
Thank you again for this invitation and timely for the program. This is important need to. With Mr. Trump's election, of course, in world politics, many people and experts are thinking now, what will be the next? I mean, next step of the Western bloc, the next step of the American government, or the next movement of NATO and the other countries. Now, Turkey actually said that maybe the last term, but I think Turkey for the last 50 or 60 days always tries to do that and in the regional and the regional cooperation and peace process. Think about the Syrian crisis. Think about the civil war, where it started like 12 years ago. Turkey made it fast with accepting also many refugees and also with the dialogue with the government. Even in the last days of the Assad regime, Turkey did the best for the securing of this, stability and maybe non-conflict situation of the region. Partially, we saw that the leaders government in Syria, they tried their best in stability ground, and I think Mr. Trump will also speak and Trump also will contribute to this dialogue environment in his own way. I say in his own way because he already made maybe a different kind of presidency for 4 years. As you remember, we also had some dialogue issues. We had some dialogue problems, positively or negatively. We can say that Mr. Trump can understand why he feels it's so important to treat. And yes, Israel must something to do. I mean, for more peaceful environment, for more humanitarian and peaceful situation in these wider zones, and also other important players. First of all, Russia, Iran will take responsibility, I think, in this new term.
That's very interesting, especially before you mentioned Iran. We know about the weakening position of Iran in Syria, and when we have to talk about the situation in the Middle East, the future expectations, Brenda, Shaffer, for example, thinking that Donald Trump will pay more attention to what's happening in Iran, its behavior, its nuclear policy, and etc. Do you think that there should be disagreement between the United States of America and Turkey when it comes to the future behavior of Iran, especially when it comes to the Middle East?
That's another important question. Thank you. As you remember that the government Trump, I mean, the Pezeshkian, new government in Iran, we have seen already that some steps are also taken from the side of Iran for more, I can say, dialogue, for more diplomacy. Yes, Iran has a deep structure, has a deep, as we accept or not, is a deep historical structure. We know that pro-government government cannot come in one room. Also, after the Islamic Revolution, we already know that Iran has another space now. We all see that in the Western media, West India, but we must speak about more deep. I think Mr. Trump's cabinet already they had speakers about some many conflicts. We all know that some of them are conflicts, unfortunately, against they already use some popular understanding inside their own electoral campaigns. But we also know that in the United States, there is another side of bureaucracy. There is another side of foreign secretary or foreign participants. And Mr. Trump will, I think, balance all this, maybe the democratic government, democratic party, misleading understanding in this reason. I mean, I remember that the Israeli-Palestine conflict in the first month of this conflict, we already see that the United States are really taking some serious, I think, that also against Iran. We have seen that some students that we are already, even between Azerbaijan and Armenian relations, we already see that some roles of the Western are really taken in a negative way. I think Mr. Trump, again, with his own way of thinking, with, balanced way of businessman, diplomat, or statesman, or tradesman, you can say that he will still Trump. I think this risk. Even one day we can see, he will visit this region. Think about this first term of Mr. Trump. We see with the North Korean leaders, as you can remember that he can appear in one day in very unexpected geography. In one day we can see him maybe in Iraq, Russia, suddenly in a BRICS summit. Why not?
That means, do you think that two very important countries in the Middle East, Turkey and Israel, can find a way to work together to diminish the level of escalation in Gaza and also find a way for moving forward together, if there is a chance for that?
The governments, actually, we already have in past centuries, but they have always positive relations with the Israeli population. I think also the Jewish communities, as you remember, in Anatolia and Istanbul, and we always have something beginning about their Zion culture, about this traditional in this Jewish history, but still, that doesn't explain this last year. That doesn't explain unfortunate events and very catastrophic humanitarian disaster in the Middle East. Still coming, unfortunately, because I said this digital era show us everything in minutes, in seconds. So, every people, my son, your maybe little relatives, they do not want to see these things, but they must. But the government of Israel, they always said that they are attacking the terror targets. First of all, yes, they can also come to table. What are the terror targets and what really they want with this heavy militaristic equipment. I think this heavy militaristic equipment, yes, some countries have now them. This technology is still rapid. Even Turkey, even Israel, they are still rapid in technology and military. We know that. But still, we must come to the table, and Israeli government must take some radical steps about challenging the non-humanitarian.
That's very interesting. And one more question about the situation in Ukraine. We do know about the growing role of Turkey and possibility to be there as to provide the platform for the future negotiations. And we know about the Trump's willingness to solve the conflict, to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. If not the United States, how do you see the future role of Turkey? And again, we cannot ignore the position of Washington and its influence in Ukraine. Therefore, have Turkey may find a balance between Western alliances, Russia, and its intention to bring peace and stability to Ukraine.
Another important issue, again, another nearby region of Turkey, this time northern region, as I said, the Ukrainian, we say a broader population to us, because Ukrainian, Turkic population is there still, we must get him first, and also our Ukrainian, very new community, we see them as also another important population under attack for many years from the Russian side. But now, I think Russia has some grievances too. Because the heavy equipment, as I said, in the Israeli situation now, another heavy Western equipment is now under the control of Ukraine. We know that these military heavy equipments are finally, they are really a symbol of they are a symbol of freedom, heavy arms race. And really, the United Nations and all international organizations have made their best to stop this heavy military race still in the middle of the Cold War. But unfortunately, they cannot succeed to strike. Now, Ukraine must think again that diplomacy is also work. We know that Russian diplomacy is now tough. It is also can be strong. It can take what it wants sometimes in a very wide geography of Russia. Is a very important country for centuries, we know that. And Mr. Putin must be listened. And this era, I think, Mr. Trump's and Putin's, I see them some similar statement interior, I find, with the important personality. Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, I think they can also discuss this Ukrainian issue positively. But if something happened about the United States, of course, for years, as you remember, from the Istanbul protest, under the presidency, under the leadership of Mr. Erdogan, we can say that Turkey is always here. Turkey, with its positive dialogue with NATO and with positive dialogue with Chile, and of course with the NATO countries, including Washington, is always coming here. We can say that, but still, we need more. We need more actors to come together. Also, Mr. Trump, Mr. Putin, and of course, Mr. Zelensky, they must come and they must think about this solution. Heavy equipment can have in days, in months. Every country can be heavy by some other country. This era is so very easy to talk about, but we do not want this. I mean, as with the scene, with this heavy catastrophic environment.
Well, Melih, thank you. Thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today.
Thank you, Ms. Lavrina.
Thank you. And thank you, dear viewers, for watching Inside Politics. Do stay with us and see you in the next edition.